What's going on, guys? Dare here with Fantasy Football Advice, coming at you with another fantasy football video. Today, we're going over the top 5 bounce back candidates for the 2020 season. Still super early, the draft just concluded this past weekend, so values, ADPs, those things are definitely still subject to change, but when we're comparing the players on this list, we're really looking at their 2019 production, then comparing it to what our expectations of these players are as we head into the 2020 season. Before we get to that, real quick shout out, Nick recently did an interview on the Fantasy Football channel, Notorious Fantasy. We will link it in the description box below. It's really cool, you should check it out. They really go in depth with the timeline of fantasy football advice and go through the back end stuff that we don't really have an opportunity to talk about on this channel, so go ahead and check that out. We'll link that in the description box below. And lastly, for information on our draft package, you can find that on our website, thefantasyfootballadvice.com. Link for that is also below, and with all that stuff out of the way, let's just hop right into the video. The first player we're going to talk about is Adam Thielen of the Minnesota Vikings. He's a player that I've talked about before in an earlier video and someone who I'll probably talk about again in the future. There are a ton of things to like about Adam Thielen and his opportunity in this upcoming season. Big news, of course, Stephon Diggs is no longer a Viking, which should open the door for him to lead this team of young receivers. As for his production last year, he really wasn't able to put it together. He wasn't healthy for the most part, was even notably banged up in their last playoff appearance. But one thing that is for sure is that he does have the faith of the Minnesota Vikings behind him with the confidence to let go of Stephon Diggs, and then through the draft we were able to replace him with Justin Jefferson. Now, one thing I want to make clear, my liking towards Adam Thielen is not any disrespect towards Justin Jefferson. In fact, adding somebody talented like Justin Jefferson could potentially open up even more opportunities in the form of sustained drives or softer coverage that Thielen has to face, knowing there is another respectable receiver playing across from him. One of the other passive benefits of the Justin Jefferson draft selection is the fact that it's simply going to keep Adam Thielen's ADP in check. Because there's a talented wide receiver battling him for targets in the eyes of the drafters, that's one reason teams may not think that his role is safe and secure, when in reality, they did need to add somebody else to replace Diggs' production, or at least attempt to. Meanwhile, Adam Thielen's role in the offense is going to remain unchanged. A more valid concern or reason to temper expectations for Adam Thielen this upcoming season would have to be strictly volume. Last season, the Minnesota Vikings were bottom 3 in percentage of passing plays versus rush plays. Clearly, that was heavily reliant on the availability of Dalvin Cook and Alexander Mattison, who performed spectacularly, but most noteworthy was that they were winning games. When you play winning football, there's no need to go back and rewrite the game script as long as you're getting those wins, and wins were something Minnesota was able to accomplish on a pretty regular basis. So while we don't expect this team to move heavily into a pass-first offense, we do have to understand that the availability and health of Dalvin Cook played a major factor in the percentage of run plays that they chose. His first healthy season since being drafted, that health and availability may not translate to the 2020 season. Regardless, even if things remain unchanged from just last season, Adam Thielen should get enough of a bump to pay off his current ADP, and depending on how high the Justin Jefferson hype goes, we may see his ADP even fall further from where it is right now. Right now, he's currently going as a wide receiver too, and while some of his upside may be tied into the team's overall volume from a passing perspective, I think the safety in this pick more than makes up for it, with the upside that if there are some injuries that happen on defense or potentially the backfield, Adam Thielen has mid-grade wide receiver 1 upside. Moving on to the next player on this list, and I'd be a liar if I didn't say early ADP impacted this one, but it's Sony Michel of the New England Patriots. It's safe to say that most people that drafted Sony Michel felt pretty disappointed after he got the volume that you were sort of expecting or hoping for, but it really didn't translate into consistent fantasy production. He was drafted inside the top 50 picks, finished just inside the top 30 for running backs, and this season is coming off the board somewhere around RB 28. So for a player like Michel to have an early ADP, very similar to where he finished last season, the first instinct would be to think that not many things changed. However, big changes happened in New England. Tom Brady, now a Tampa Bay Buccaneer, and Jarrett Stidham is the current quarterback for the New England Patriots. And what does that indicate to me? This team is not expecting to have a high-powered passing offense. Bill Belichick, though, is a very good coach. He knows how to play to players' strengths, and knowing he has a weapon like Sony Michel out of the backfield likely means they're going to rely on the run game pretty heavily in 2020. The main beneficiary in that very likely scenario is Sony Michel, who was already top 10 in total rushes last season, who has also proved to be somewhat capable in the passing game as well. The inexperience of Stidham may even give Sony Michel more opportunities when it comes to red zone plays. More scoring opportunities, more potential upside, and where he's going in drafts, there really isn't much guaranteed volume. Right now he's being drafted just ahead of Darius Geis and Kareem Hunt, who will likely have less of a featured role on offenses that aren't elite by any means. So just to summarize, Sony Michel had a somewhat underwhelming rookie season, comes into 2020 with the potential to not only lead this backfield, but could be a focal point of the entire offense. An offense that should be assisted by solid coaching on the defensive and special teams end to provide positive starting field position for them, a potentially increased red zone role due to the inexperience of the new quarterback Stidham, and it's a guy who has proven, despite a lot of injury concerns, to find his way to the field, playing in 29 of 32 potential games as an NFL pro. So for those reasons, Michel is definitely a bounce back candidate for the 2020 season. But let's move on to the third player. The next player on this list sort of reminds me of Adam Thielen, and that's T.Y. Hilton of the Indianapolis Colts. The reason I say that, of course, is because the Indianapolis Colts invested heavy draft capital into a wide receiver in the 2020 draft. Clearly, they want to supply Phillip Rivers with as many weapons as they possibly can. Throw in Michael Pittman, who they drafted in the second round, with Hilton, Zach Pascal, and Paris Campbell, and you have yourself a pretty respectable receiving core. Now, a lot of people are going to be majorly concerned with T.Y. Hilton's role in the offense now that they drafted Pittman with their first selection in the draft. That concern is completely valid. However, you do have to factor in that the type of player T.Y. Hilton is, that being a speedster, a deep play threat, he doesn't need a ton of volume in order to produce. In fact, in 2018, he was able to average over 14.4 half PPR fantasy points on just 120 targets. That's certainly an attainable amount of targets. The team themselves threw 545 passes last season, and you have to think that goes up with the addition of Phillip Rivers as the quarterback. Now, does he need 120 targets to pay off his draft price? Not at all. A target for T.Y. Hilton is much more valuable than, let's say, a target for Julian Edelman. And overall, his current ADP is that of a high-end wide receiver 3. He's going behind Tyler Lockett, and there's a potential it drops even lower once the news of them drafting a wide receiver at the top of the second round settles in and the rankings start to adjust. So it's possible you could land him as your flex or wide receiver 3. And when it comes to the flex players, you do want that immense upside. Getting a player who's guaranteed for 4 for 40 may not win you your league. Putting in a higher risk player with the potential to pop off that you can play the matchups on, somebody like T.Y. Hilton, could give you that extra firepower to beat some of those better teams in your league. So definitely keep an eye out for T.Y. Hilton and where his ADP is come draft time. But considering he finished as wide receiver 57 last year, there is a ton of room for a bounce back for T.Y. Hilton in 2020. Moving on to the fourth bounce back candidate, and I know it's not super exciting because it's a quarterback, but if you're looking for a guy to get in the late rounds with some bounce back potential, look in the direction of Matthew Stafford. Although he only played in a total of 8 games last year, while he was on the field, he was spectacular. In fact, his second best fantasy performance on a per game average, when it comes to the amount of fantasy points he scored, it was his second best season of his entire career. Yes, we're talking the Calvin Johnson days and before. He averaged 20.8 fantasy points through 8 games. The only season he had that topped that was in 2011 when he threw for over 5,000 yards and 35 touchdowns. Now, of course, he was able to do that through a 16-game pace, which makes that even more impressive. But what he was able to show us through just 8 games is a good sign on what he's able to do if healthy in 2020. As for his health as we head into 2020, he has been medically cleared to take part in off-season activities and most notably has already resumed working out on his own. One thing that we know about Matthew Stafford is that if you give him the tools, he can get it done, especially for fantasy. Now, he is going to get a knock because he is a pure pocket passer. We know right now running is key, but what he's proved to us in previous seasons is that if you get him the right tools around him, he can produce at the level of expectations that you have. Kenny Golladay and Marvin Jones with TJ Hawkinson and Kerryon Johnson out of the backfield is an incredible amount of weapons for Matthew Stafford to have, and more than enough for him to succeed. Top 10 numbers from a fantasy perspective, if these pieces remain healthy, is easily attainable for Matthew Stafford. While in 2019 he was only able to appear in 8 games, unfortunately. What is most notable is that in 5 of those 8 games he scored over 23 fantasy points, which no quarterback outside of Lamar Jackson averaged over 23 fantasy points. And in fact, Matthew Stafford ranked 4th in fantasy points per game. Now, 4 of the 5 quarterbacks that average similar to him, Lamar Jackson, Deshaun Watson, Russell Wilson, Patrick Mahomes, these are guys going quite a bit earlier in the draft than Matthew Stafford, who is currently coming off the board as the 13th quarterback. That's right, a player who finished top 4 when it comes to fantasy points per game, with his offensive weapons returning with a little more experience when we're talking TJ Hawkinson. They added Swift to the backfield, so hopefully their run game can get some improvement, and he's going 9 spaces lower than he finished on average points per game scored from a fantasy perspective. So to me, the bounce back for Matthew Stafford is going to more rely on the health of him and his weapons around him, and not so much on if he has the ability to produce. As long as he's on the field and has those weapons around him, he's going to perform, and where he's currently going in drafts, a lot of people seem to be counting him out. The final player we have on this list is a tight end, and it's Evan Engram of the New York Giants. And with Evan Engram, you know the ability is not the issue. It's the health, his availability. And frankly, if Evan Engram is on the field, he's a top 5 option at the position. Unfortunately for him, his ADP is still relatively high. He's the tight end 7 coming off the board. But I have seen him slip in some early mock drafts, and ADP is still likely to change between this point and the start of the season. So of course, early ADP isn't going to play a huge factor until we see where it shakes out as we get closer to kickoff for 2020. If you are looking at early ADP, one thing that always sticks out is how high everybody is on Daniel Jones being a sleeper. Yes, he performed very well last season, but this team also didn't bring in any real weapons when it comes to the draft or free agency. So the main contributors in this offense are going to be Darius Slayton, Sterling Shepard, and Evan Engram. And if you don't think Evan Engram will play a massive role while healthy, then you are definitely mistaken. One factor that excites me about his potential availability for the upcoming season, after seeing Austin Hooper put together a Pro Bowl season, then signed a massive contract for the tight end position, and knowing that Evan Engram is set to hit free agency at the end of this season, well, that has to be more motivating than ever, and something that's going to be an extra push to help him take care of himself and do whatever it takes to make it on the field on Sunday. Obviously, injuries are extremely difficult to predict, and Evan Engram doesn't have the best track record when it comes to making it on the field. But considering the team didn't bring in a ton of weapons when it comes to the passing game, he has a ton of money on the line if he wants to get a massive contract this upcoming season. And if he performs, some team is likely going to be throwing a ton of money at him, if not the New York Giants. Like I said though, I have seen him drop in a lot of early mock drafts, and my interest in taking him where he's currently going may not 100% be there, but the time you want to take a player with top 5 upside is going to be after 2 down seasons, his ADP is the lowest it's been, and you know you have a player who's fighting for their own contract. So for those reasons, I definitely see Evan Engram being a solid candidate for a bounce back season. He surely has a lot riding on it, and we've seen as long as he can stay healthy and be on the field, he's going to produce. Let us know in the comment section which players you think have a strong chance to bounce back for 2020. And if you did enjoy this video, how about hitting the like button? If you're new to the channel, please hit that subscribe button. We thank you all for watching, and we'll catch you on the next one.